saying yes and yes.
We are live. Okay.
I'm
So, a couple of quick details regarding kashrut in the kitchen. One little
It's been cancelled?
holdover from last week, huh?
Kashrut's been cancelled?
Temporarily suspended. Yeah. So, one issue is that it's interesting. The Gemara does talk about this, and it appears in the Shulchan Aruch as well. That if you happen to be baking something dairy, that you should bake it in a different shape, right? An interesting visual cue that what you're eating has some kind of either butter or milk or buttermilk or cream, whatever in it somehow. In Israel, for example, the industry standard is that burekas that are triangular are halavi, and the ones that are square are either parava or bisari. They produce them in massive quantities in Israel because this is like insulin to diabetics. The burekas is a sustenance food in Israel. So
this is dairy and this is meat.
Yeah. So one opinion holds that the Gemara says you should make them ki'ain Torah, make them like the eye of a bull, whatever that means. So one opinion says just like bulls have really big eyes. We get this a lot. Kids with giant eyeballs in Israel, they call them einei egel. They say kids have eyes like cows because they have these big, massive eyeballs that pop out of their heads. So one opinion holds you just make it big, like bake a bigger bread than normal if you're going to make it this way, so people should be able to see from the size. The other opinion says no, just like there's a somewhat kind of triangular shape or appearance to them, or it's the shape that counts. In other words, and not the size itself. So Shulchan Aruch holds really any way you do it is fine. It's only a rabbinic concept to prevent you from doing something, making a mistake. But you should basically be trying to make some kind of distinction or some kind of visually clear sign or symbol that what you're baking is halavi. So pizza is baked as a whole pie, but typically served in triangular slices. Interesting little detail to it. Any other bread that you're baking, the idea is just that there should be some kind of heker. It should be identifiable, recognizable. I don't know that this is practiced, just so you know, in modern America today. I think the simple explanation for it is because in your own home, well, who's going to follow you and say what you should and shouldn't be doing? That's not true. There are people who do that too, but but they're annoying. In the restaurant world, there's just no establishment that I'm aware of that serves both milk and meat in the same place. So in the event that I were producing burekas that are both halavi and meat, then people who come to sit at my establishment would probably need that extra step of security, extra barrier of safety to make sure that they're not mixing the two of them up or eating them together. If all I serve is halavi, and you know this when you step into the restaurant, and there's a big teudah on the outside that says halavi or bisari, so I guess there's not much room for for ambiguity or for any lack of clarity. So I guess that's what we rely upon. The other similar halakhah to this is that if you happen to be cooking something with the example given in the Rema, but the Rishonim talk about this. If you're cooking with almond milk, familiar with this? Cooking with almond milk? I happen to love almond milk. I'm a huge fan of marzipan.
Marzipan is almond milk?
Marzipan is the Ashkenazi halwa. It's just like Sephardim are with sesame seeds, so are the Ashkenazim with almonds. It's just ground into a paste with tons of sugar. It tastes really good because it's sugary paste. What could be wrong? But very tasty marzipan. So you bake it a little bit.
It's also a fantastic bakery in Yerushalayim.
That's a very good question.
Yeah, heard of the place too. So at any rate, if you happen to be cooking or baking something that has almond milk in it, so because by the time it's cooked or baked and mixed with other ingredients, it has a somewhat creamy texture. It's very tasty almond milk. Has a certain creamy texture to it. How would I know if I'm eating by Zev and Danya that Danya made these pancakes with almond milk? I was under the assumption that they were dairy and that I shouldn't be eating them because I had meat for breakfast before I came. So the answer is simple. The Rama says, really, just like the Gemara recommends that if you're baking something that's halavi, you should make it in an unusual shape or an easily distinguishable shape, such that people shouldn't make mistakes. So here he says, what should you do? You should leave a few slices of almonds on the plate. So think of like a gourmet high cuisine. you'd actually be just like dropping a few slivers of almonds on the plate, so as to give an indication of what the thing is made of. And this way, you know that that the cooked item in question is actually parve. By the way, Chazak Baruch to leave for got an interesting email with a bunch of different etymological suggestions for the origin of parve. I despise them all. I don't think any of them made much sense, but it's neither here nor there. We can post it on the website just for everybody's reading pleasure.
Similarly,
Just 1 second. Sorry, we neglected to mention that the TSC Night Shiur was sponsored anonymously by someone very sweet and generous and who deserves to be mentioned, but we will respect the sponsor's wishes. But Chazak Baruch nonetheless for the efforts. And the sponsor was meant to be a sign of gratitude and thanks for the Beit Knesset. So if you're cooking something that happens to have almond milk, or the Rama didn't know from coconuts, but the assumption would be the same. Coconut milk is also really tasty, just FYI.
It's too watery.
It depends. They sell more concentrated versions of it. Ask me after class. Very tasty stuff. But you can cook rice, for example. Some very tasty stews that you can make with coconut milk. Has a protein-rich, kind of milky, creamy texture to it. And the same would apply. So a little bit of shredded coconut would be great. There's nothing you'd lose by doing it except for revealing the secrets of your ingredients. But it's not a bad thing to do. And at the same time, the Rama adds, this one is great. If for whatever reason you happen to be drinking fish blood, because who doesn't drink fish blood? I mean, really. You've never... Where did you grow up? Nobody drinks fish blood in Tveria. So...
Fish blood?
Fish blood.
okay, that's okay, right?
Right, well, so the Mishnah says that there's no such thing, no isur that... No, I'm not joking. People drink cod liver oil. What would cod liver oil?
That's oil, that's not...
It must be nasty. Anyway, I'm sure it is if it's good for you. So the Mishnah says very clearly there's no isur when it comes to fish and locusts. Any one of the 4 kosher locusts, the grasshopper, the chargol, solam, chagav, arbe. So any one of these species doesn't require shechita, first of all. And since they require no shechita, there's no concept of dam hanefesh. Dam hanefesh is the blood that we're not allowed to consume. The lifeblood, literally the blood that comes out during and after the shechita.
So only from a kosher fish can you drink the blood, or can you drink the blood from any?
No, so the non-kosher blood from a non-kosher fish is hayotze min hatameh tameh. Whatever comes from or is produced by or byproduct of something non-kosher. So the milk of a sow, a female pig, is just as non-kosher as the meat.
Honey?
But you're within your rights to drink the blood of a fish or of a locust. In fact, the Gemara goes in Masechet Chulin, the whole discussion about everything that's asur. There's something that's just like it that's mutara. A few examples, somewhat colorful, but just like you can eat blood, you're actually permitted to eat from the liver, which tastes effectively like the morsia or the boudin noir, these blood kinds of bloody products. So liver is basically blood. It tastes just like that. We're not allowed to eat insects, but we're allowed to eat from these 4 locust, grasshopper things. So it's not asur to consume the blood of such creatures, but the Rama says if you happen to be taking like fish blood shots, the real Bloody Mary, so you would just be advised to put some maybe fish scales, or fish bones,
Inside the drink?
No, that'd be nasty. You put some, maybe on like the plate that's under it.
On the rim of the shot
With
glass.
the salt.
Something, tequila kind of thing. You wet some sea salt and then you stick some of the scales to
So
it.
that care, right?
Yeah, basically you're doing something that makes it clear and obvious that what you're doing is not what's suspected of being asur.
Buy the almond milk with meat in a cup. I should have either like a different kind of cup.
It should be something clear and identifiable and unmistakable.
So someone has
Right?
that with a steak,
I think-
soy milk, and maybe nauseous.
Yeah. No, soy milk is bitter. I can't forgive it for that. But this may be my own interpretation, but I think that's why all these phony soy hot dogs and hamburgers, they look nasty. But I think looking nasty is part of the concept. Like, it looks nasty. I'm eating it with cheese, but it still looks nasty. So you can tell that it's not a cheeseburger. It's actually a cheap soy substitute for whatever. But okay, just a little holdover detail I wanted to mention. it is important, especially where it's not easy to tell. If something is Besori or Chalavi, you should at least try to make some kind of heker for it. It probably helps if you make some kind of announcement. You can say, by the way, the rice was cooked not with yogurt or with milk, but with coconut milk, etc. But the advice given by the Rishonim is actually to put a little bit of the element that you included in it onto it as well. And look, in the food products that have good hashgachot, typically good, I shouldn't say that. The food products that have fancier, more mehudar hashgachot are typically produced in such a way. So like I said, the dairy burekas, dairy pasta, tortellini, I think it's a little bit hard to produce very varied shapes, but they do make them in different shapes, square, circle, etc. But they are supposed to be somewhat sensitive to that. Yafeh. On to one of my all-time favorite kashrut topics, the topic of worms and insects. And this is, first of all, they're delicious. Don't make faces like that. If you haven't had insects, worms, and fish blood, you have missed the trifecta of delicacy. Right, so who eats worms and insects? Here's a quote, I believe this is from the Maharal Prague, if I'm not mistaken, makes a halachic comment on the apsak, a ruling made by Turumat edition. So it doesn't appear in the Gemara that we have to sift flour before using it. Just so you know, mentioned by the Turumat edition for the first time, maybe late 13th, early 14th century. And it's actually storied, it's told that he himself wrote the questions and the answers. That there weren't even questions that were presented to him. He wrote the book in a kind of question-answer, call-response kind of fashion. But it was a very popular book at the time, and a lot of Halakhah is drawn from it.
What book is this?
The Turumat edition. So, Turumat edition says that really, before you bake anything with flour, it's good practice to sift it first in a sifter, right? Nafa in Hebrew. Not nafa in Arabic, that's anis, but they used to bake breads with this in Morocco. They would sift the flour, and he said this is good advice, it's a good idea. Why? Because often enough you have these milvin, they call them in Yiddish, these little tiny little mealyworms, little small gray, more worms than insects. No, and they run pretty fast too. They're kind of hard to catch. So this is very common in Israel, just so you know. When the climate is hot, you will find that really you sift flour and you find things in Israel. Here in America, it's not quite as common. If it does happen, yeah, here in America, it's not quite as common because the climate's just not as hot, at least not for as much of the year. But he says this is good advice to prevent the accidental ingestion of insects. You're going to bake the bread; they're probably going to die in the process. They'll just be there, hanging out, waiting to be eaten. I regret the fact that this was before the days where they had smartphones with good cameras on them. I once took a pita out of a package, and baked right into the crust of the pita was a mealworm that was about 1.25 inches long. It was just a worm baked into the pita itself. It was delicious. You could see the thing, you know, and it's on one of these bags with all these fancy hashgachot about everything's been sifted and the kemach hashan and the bishul Israel. So who's the ahwal that missed a worm? After all these mashgichim and all this sensitivity, you'd think that there's like a laser sight on each and every detail of every pita. And really, who's the imbecile that let this thing hit the production line with a worm on it and didn't notice that the worm browns differently from flour during the baking process? So there's a darker brown than the rest of the pita. But I take pictures of these things sometimes because it's amazing. First of all, let this be a lesson to you. Just because the package says kosher doesn't mean the contents necessarily are. When a supervision company vouches for the kashrut of a particular product, right? Think pre-checked lettuce or washed broccoli, etc. All they're saying is that some effort, minimal or maximal, I'm not going to comment, some effort was made to remove the easiest insects to remove or to get rid of certain things you don't want to get rid of. In some cases, the process is very chemical. Just putting that out there. Rabbi Amar, the Sephardi chief rabbi of Israel, he actually wrote a psak saying that there's an interesting halachic question to ask about some of these heavily sprayed vegetable and leaf products that are probably detrimental to your health. whether or not they have insects is one thing, but what they do to your body after you consume them is something else. So fruits and vegetables are somewhat problematic that way. So the Shulchan Aruch does recommend sifting your flour. It's a recommendation based on Rishonim. It doesn't say the Gemara have to do it. The Gemara, they were grinding their flour by hand. The old mortar and pestle, maharaza, they would literally buy grains of wheat and sit there pounding them into a powder. They would sift in order to get rid of the chaff, the grain, the bran of the wheat. I should say the chaff is removed usually before that. So they would sift just to get rid of the bran on the outside, the peel on the outside of the seed. And they were baking fresh, and nobody really ground much more flour than they needed. There was no point, and it's very easy for insects to consume because it's a powder. So maybe they just baked it fresher, more likely than not. The Maharal, I believe it was, who commented, and he said that already in their time, he's talking about Europe, he said we should be extra careful about doing this. If it comes in the form of a suggestion by the Tumat Hadeshin, if it's not quite obligatory, he said it probably should be by now, because he said like this: living here in these Gerilot, in this region of Europe, who can say that he doesn't consume these things? Who can say that he hasn't eaten or accidentally swallowed these milvin, these mealy worms? So a little bit of a difficult reality. Insects are forbidden for us to consume. There are at least 4 or 5 or maybe 6, according to Ben Ish Chai, different interdictions that you violate by consuming them. Is one of them, because it's a nasty, disgusting thing to eat. I don't care if the Mexicans, their tequila, have a good time. It's a nasty, disgusting thing to do. Second of all, it's what's called a b'riya b'fnei atzmah. And this touches a bit of what we've been speaking the last couple of weeks. B'riya b'fnei atzmah means it's an entire entity. It's a whole essence. It's a creature. So we're used to thinking of things in terms of, let's say, kazait, kabitza. When it comes to milk and meat, we think in terms of batil b'shishim. There is no bitul for an entire creature. So if I throw a lizard into my pot of cholent, right, and I eat the cholent assuming that I have more than 60 lizards worth of meat in the pot, and the lizard got lost in the sauce, I will have violated an isur because the lizard does not get nullified. It doesn't get ignored as far as the proportion. If it's a whole lizard, correct. If it was missing like one finger, or an eye, or a piece of the tail, already I'm not guilty of that. It's nasty, probably nasty, which you're guilty. You violated a whole bunch of rules of etiquette, morals, ethics, and cuisine. It's nasty, but it's not halachically asur. So what happens if a spider or an insect falls into my pot?
You can pluck something.
So right away I try to pull the thing out, and I only got one leg or one wing. In theory. And I'm not saying you're making faces. I would serve you half a mosquito.
In your house, it was fine.
So you're making faces like I would serve you such a thing. I mean, you wouldn't know. So if I pulled off one leg or one wing, then it's no longer a b'riya b'fnei atzmah. It's not an entire creature. It might be most of what's otherwise a nasty creature, but not something that's necessarily halachically, by definition, asur. So this is true of worms. True of insects, true of anything that's not permissible for us to consume. Most of these things are somewhat small, ants, spiders, etc. It makes it difficult to find them. So,
what about broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts? There's no way to find every single thing.
But I told you I love this concept. I love the topic.
Water with salt. I've seen, and you're like, but still, there's no guarantee.
Okay,
Are we
so
guilty?
let's take a bit of a stroll down halachic history lane, right? First of all, it was the Torah tradition that mentions this in the Middle Ages. It's not like this is a Mishnah or a Gemara. So the Mishnah and Gemara say, hey, you can't eat these insects. You have to be careful about them, right? That's fine. We take certain precautions. The reality is, chances are, if you're not doing these things, that you probably are consuming certain quantities of these insects. If it's asur or not asur, we'll talk about it in a second. When it comes to how you check these things, how thoroughly you check these things, I'm just putting this out there. There is nothing mentioned in the Gemara as non-kosher fruits or vegetables, or leafy greens or herbs, etc. In other words, there's no species identified by Chazal as strawberries. They're just not kosher. Like it's asur to eat strawberries now, right? So they discovered them in New York and New Jersey. They're native to North America. I hate to break your heart. They call them fraises in French, but stolen from us. The permissibility or lack of permissibility of a particular fruit, vegetable, nut, etc., does not appear in the Gemara as such. It's a new concept that we should say there are certain fruits or vegetables that are impossible to check, they're difficult to check, that need or don't need to be checked. That's all invented. I'm not saying it's totally unfounded, that there's no basis for it. I'm just saying, let's be honest, that's a new concept. So let's make some ground rules very clear. Number one, if it's microscopic, it's mutar. There is no such thing as having to look into your water, for example. Your water.
I mean, everybody get filters.
Right, so everybody's got filters at the restaurants. They have YU everywhere. They have filtered water. They have, I'm sure they invested thousands of dollars in putting filters everywhere. For what? There's microscopic crustaceans that no one can see. If I wish I eat enough of them, I can tell you what they taste like. You know they exist. Bacteria exist too, my friend. What's the point? If it's microscopic, it's not asur. It doesn't exist as far as we're concerned. So, for health reasons, so they cause infections, they cause health problems. People have been drinking water in New York for thousands of years, if you count the Native Americans. Maybe it didn't look like it does in the East River right now, but...
What happened to them?
Right. That's a good point. Touché. So, identifying something as a species that shouldn't be consumed is a relatively new concept. Now, it's possible, I'll give you an example, Brussels sprouts. Mm-hmm. They're often identified as something that some hashgachot won't even, well, they won't give supervision to it. It's a sort of food to consume at home, it's something else. What's the suspicion? The suspicion is that these things grow one leaf on top of the other, and the insects can burrow through them and pick through them and be all the way in the middle. You wouldn't know. So it's one thing if you're checking lettuce or if you're checking cabbage and take them off leaf by leaf. And while we're on the topic, there is no halachic requirement to soak anything or to wash it or to treat it with soap or vinegar or salt in solution or without. These are pieces of advice that people come up with. So, how do you get insects off of the lettuce? So some of these insecticides might kill the thing, but it'd be stuck there and you'd never know because it's not moving anymore. In some cases, it's just, if there's salt water or vinegar, they might detach and try to get to a less unpleasant part of the world. But it doesn't mean that you necessarily got rid of them. So first of all, there is no substitute for your eyes. That's it. Take a leaf of lettuce, you check it on both sides, there are no insects, you can eat it. That's all.
Blind person?
That's how my grandmother ate. What's
Blind person?
So he gets the Braille lettuce.
right? So how do you do for someone who? There are a few halachic questions about this. Someone who's blind. Well, here's the thing. First of all, anything that you can have checked by somebody else, it's not a bad idea. The other question becomes, what's the suspicion? Are we talking about every leaf has a problem with it, and therefore there's a chazakah, there's an established assumption, an educated guess, there's something wrong until I've had it checked and I've established that there's nothing wrong with it? Or are we talking about a suspicion, even a somewhat far-reaching suspicion? If it's a far-reaching suspicion, so probably chances are there's nothing wrong. Okay, so chances are nothing wrong. So where do we rely on this? Situations where it's unfeasible. For example, you ever buy canned beans?
Yes.
I won't comment on the custom from a culinary perspective. I like to soak my beans and change the water. Yeah, makes them less gassy, just FYI. Change the water once or twice. But the canned beans, so some of us would like to believe that they're checking each and every one of these little garbanzo beans, the chickpeas, individual hummus. I remember that. I don't know if they still do this in Israel. There was one company that manufactured these cold salads, the salatim. And there was one under certain badats that said, every kol gargir hummus, every grain of hummus was checked. When I said, I laughed when I saw it. I said, yeah, right. Who's sitting there checking one bean? It would cost $500 a pound. It seems like hummus that's more expensive than filet mignon. Really? Someone sitting there and checking each and every grain? It's ridiculous. It's absurd as a claim, let alone that there should be a halachic necessity to do this. The reason for it is simple. The hummus is going to be ground anyway, and so all the insects in it are going to be ground too. They're going to be less than 60, 1 to 60, etc. You can't taste them. So more important than 1 to 60 or 1 out of 61 is that there's no flavor being exuded or emitted. And it's not a whole insect.
Well, when you say whole...
So I'm not saying you can add spiders intentionally tir matbucha in order to get a little bit of extra protein. But at the end of the day, if there happens to be a dismembered insect, anything that you're going to puree, say mashed potatoes, or you're grinding, you can make rice flour, you can make, so regular flour, just so you know. Again, if you ground it just now, any insects that were in it were also properly ground, and therefore there's no reason to check it. You bought it prepackaged, maybe their insects came into the package afterwards. Actually, what they say today is it's more the eggs that were laid by the insects in the grains that weren't necessarily destroyed in the grinding process. So the concern or the suspicion is for something that's going to be hard for you to find, but it'd have to be whole, it'd have to be entire in order to be a problem. So the requirement to check things one by one or to go through them is a very onerous task. It's difficult to do this. It costs a lot of money. If you had a mashgiach in a restaurant, the mashgiach would be the one who would be doing this. You'd rather not use chemicals where they're avoidable, where it's possible.
But what about the Brussels sprouts? So you can't have Brussels sprouts at all? I mean, these are the healthiest foods to eat. They have the most micronutrients and everything.
There was a set 3 years ago that you can't import them.
You cannot?
Forget it.
Yep. But then it's
What if it's
I think
plastic
it's soap and
bag?
water and
Or plastic bag?
Well, here's the thing.
Some people are only letting you eat the bottom of the broccoli, also the stem.
The stem.
I think there's a well-known Kashrut organization here in America that doesn't allow you to serve asparagus. They make you just cut the tops off because in the ends, where the leaves are very small, there's a preponderance of insects. Okay, so look, if you look with a microscope, you'll find a lot of things. The question is, first of all, what's visible to the naked eye? Is it possible that I look at the broccoli, I see nothing, and I consume it? And the answer is yes. It's possible that you check it, you look at it. I mean, how you want to examine it, you want to take a knife or use your fingers, whatever it is, but you look through it. You can't see any insects. Probably there are no insects there. If there are insects that are small enough that I can't see them with the naked eye, it's probably not that big a deal. Broccoli has been consumed, just so you know. We're not going to cast aspersions on previous generations and say, well, our great-grandparents didn't know Torah from anything, and if they knew what they were doing, they'd be checking the way we do. No. My grandmother, Alaa Shalom, used to pick up the leaves of lettuce. She would check them by the sunlight, one side, the other side, and no soaking, no vinegar, no salt, no soap. The same applies for all the fruits and vegetables that she ate. You give it a once over with your eyes, and that's it. There are pieces of advice that I'll give you an example. Some spot checks are helpful. Rabbi Avidan Elkin was very strict on this topic, so he recommends that when you're soaking beans, first of all you soak them, you rehydrate them because they expand, and then you can see if there are any holes in them. So you go through them, you roll them all over just to make sure there's no holes in them, and he said take 3 and open them up. See what you come up with.
so it's the same thing if you buy a head of lettuce, you only have to check for a certain amount.
How to let us, I'm sure it's going to help because at the end of the day, there is a suspicion that insects end up on the inside. Brussels sprouts, for example, I don't know, unless you want to peel off leaves one by one, if it's that healthy, then you'll invest in it. But I don't know how feasible that is. If there's a reasonable suspicion that there are insects that you can see there with the naked eye, then you'd want to check. What happens if you didn't check? Just putting that out there. Are you guilty of eating insects? The answer is not necessarily, because we'd have to know there's an insect in order to make such an accusation. So the only thing you'd be guilty of is maybe, not checking where a check would be advisable or recommendable. Unless you took an insect, and you can't make a bracha on an insect, but you made your l'shem yichud and you ate it this way, then you're guilty of eating an insect. You're violating, as we said, 4 to 6 isurim midoraita, 4 to 6 biblical interdictions. That's not the case if someone takes Brussels sprouts, cooks them, and eats them. Unless you intentionally ate insects that you know are there, you're not guilty of eating insects intentionally. Maybe there were insects that you didn't know about. Here the question becomes, what's your obligation to check? You follow the difference. Your kavanah means something here.
You just said the worm was delicious.
I'm sure. I was kidding.
Because if you see it,
Oh, okay. So I thought if it was already cooked into the...
Well, the
I
bag
don't-
had
it
a
was
shgacha
dead.
on it, so if there's a worm there, it must be a kosher worm. So it's
Okay.
like-
And I thought maybe there was some rule that if it was dead and it was already cooked into it, you didn't.
Just had a very funny discussion with somebody about this. Someone was interested in serving meat from the back half of the cow in a certain establishment. So the establishment said, fine, we're not into this so much, but whatever. And they said, if you're going to do this, you'd be doing it like this and the other thing. So and just make sure that you're buying the meat from our hashgacha. So I said, so what does it matter if the meat's under your hashgacha? In that case, Gidan Hashem and the Chelev are also under your hashgacha. So does it matter who performed the shechita? The nikur has to be done properly. So there's insistence by the certain organization. No, if this restaurant is going to be serving from this, we won't come out against it. We won't fight you. Just make sure that you're buying the meat from this kind of. So what does that mean? So if I get chelev with hashgacha of the OU, it's okay. I got chelev with hashgacha of the chav k, star k, okay. It's all didn't make any sense to me. So just because the worm had hashgacha on the package doesn't mean that it's permissible. I have to learn halakhah. You can't just rely on these stickers and labels and packages. Could be the package was compromised, you didn't see, so maybe there was a hole or a puncture in the bag and something got in there. In the case of beans, really good piece of advice, when you're buying beans in the supermarket, these little 1 pound bags, just pick the bag up and shake it a little bit. If you see dust settle to the bottom of it, then something's been eating it. Even if it's dead, it could be dried and dead by now, but a good sign there was something inside it, a little bit of powder or dust. So there is a difference, right? There's a distinction that we need to make between picking up an insect and eating it, and eating something that wasn't checked for insects. It's a completely different reality. No one has the right to walk around saying, if you eat Brussels sprouts, you're eating insects. You don't know. You didn't open the Brussels sprouts. You didn't check them for me. I didn't check them. The question is, what am I guilty of? So if we know for a fact that the majority of these things are infested, niguin, then we would have to be careful about them. We'd have to check them. If it's not the majority, but even a significant proportion of them, then the question becomes, what's my moral obligation to inspect these things before eating them? Am I allowed to rely on the majority that are fine, that are okay, right? This is what's called samchinan aruba. Are we allowed to rely on the majority? If the majority of Brussels sprouts are okay, and let's say it's 10% of them that have insects in them, is there anything wrong with me eating 10 of them, assuming one of them, statistically speaking, might have had something wrong with it? Or do we say, well, if the majority of them have this problem, or even a significant minority, it becomes asur, maybe midrabanan, for you to check. Asur midrabanan is not asur midoraita. Asur midrabanan, if it's rabbinically forbidden, that means that it's a rabbinic recommendation, a rabbinic stricture. It's not that I violated those 4 or 5 or 6 avirot midoraita. I didn't transgress a biblical concept by not performing a rabbinic inspection. You follow the logic? The difference between picking up a worm and eating it, and eating something that may or may not have had a worm in it. As long as I didn't check, I don't know. Is that an excuse not to check? So here's an interesting halachic debate. Is there such a thing as relying on these majorities, or on the plausible scenarios, when I have the capacity to check? So if I can check in order to make sure the situation is kosher, maybe the right thing to do is to check. Or is the purpose of the chazakah, the purpose of the established, educated assumption, to relieve me of this responsibility? If someone were to conduct a scientific study and say, 93% of the broccoli sold in the US does not have insects on it, would that be enough for me to eat it always without ever checking it? So there is a bit of halakhic debate about the origin of the necessity, the requirement to check certain things. If the majority happens not to be problematic, then maybe we don't have the moral imperative to check everything. Same time, we have a concept that the Gemara does make pretty emphatic, is that whatever is possible for us to check, we check. We only rely on these established, these educated assumptions where we have no choice but to do so.
Is that just by Kashrut? Because we find by Nida, for example, like a lot of times they tell you don't check.
That's something else. That's
why,
more.
even though it could be a possibility, it's kind of almost like I always thought it was like outside,
Right.
But we don't know.
It's a little bit out of the bounds of what we're discussing here. Just it's for a different reason, because
Okay.
The check itself might be the problem. Leave it at that. So when it comes to your ability to check something, do we just assume that we're not required to check because the majority of them, if there is such a thing as an established reality, the majority doesn't require checking? Or do we assume there's nothing wrong unless you find something that does have a significant proportion of problems in it? In which case, I would say, you have the opportunity to check, you should check. And maybe b'di'avad, if you didn't check, we can assume it's okay. We would pass it. So there's quite a bit of debate on this topic. The answer is not so quick and easy. if you're making a puree or grinding things or chopping or slicing them in such a way that you're likely to destroy whatever's inside, chances are you're doing fine. That's what we rely on when we buy spices. Just so you know, if you're buying ground cumin or ground turmeric or fenugreek or paprika, whatever it is, for all we know, there were insects there. We don't even care at this point because there's no way they comprise more than 1 to 61 of the product that we're looking to buy, and even if so, they were ground. And as a matter of fact, it's not even asur to buy whole seeds and to grind them without checking them, because here, first of all, it's going to be, if there is anything which is a safek to begin with, it's going to be ground out of existence and null in proportion. To check them one by one would be a chumrah, would be a stricture. It may not be required halakhically. Checking the hummus that you're going to grind anyway into a paste is likewise unnecessary. Or for that matter, checking the grains of wheat before you grind them. That would make the price of these commodities out of reach for the majority of people. So it's one thing if you know, first of all, it's a safek. I'm not intentionally grinding spiders into my hummus in order to make it taste better. I don't know for a fact that there aren't spiders in there. Maybe chances are every so often there is a spider in there, but at the end of the day, I'm not doing this intentionally, and whatever may, by chance, appear to be in there is going to be ground up anyway. There's a difference between not knowing and not checking, and knowing and intentionally grinding. Because here, what I potentially might have violated, it's called en matlin nisur lechatechila. There's no halachic justification for intentionally nullifying something. So if I say, oh my God, I'd really love to have this like subtle taste of cheese in my cholent, even though I know it's asur. So just because I have 60 or 70 pieces of beef doesn't mean I can throw in a piece of cheese for the heck of it, just because I want to indulge. If you can taste it, it's asur, even if it's 1 to 1,000. And if you can't taste it, even if you can't taste it, there's no permitting circumstance for you to throw it in there intentionally. If it happened to get mixed up, that's when we rely on things like proportion and how to what degree it can be tasted, etc. So as long as you don't know for a fact there's something in it, you're already in a different status. Whether or not it makes sense to check or not, the answer is, why not? Check what you can to the best of your ability. There are certain food items that it makes more sense to check than others. So if people are sensitive to strawberries, go ahead, give them a quick once over, look at them, and that's it. You don't need to go crazy with them. Some things are harder to check than others, and people may or may not choose to indulge. Raspberries happen to have that little cavity in them that makes it a little bit difficult to deal with. So I think the Star K only approves of crushed raspberries. There is such a product. They use it in like ice cream and pie. So it's crushed. So what do we care that it's crushed? Well, simple. I don't know if there are insects there. If there were, they were already ground up. They were lost in the sauce. And so not a big issue. Cranberry sauce, same thing. It's a very rich halachic topic, yeah.
And what about frozen vegetables and all that?
So the freezing process probably killed anything that was in it.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't remove it.
Yeah.
So it's asur to eat live animals, it's asur to eat dead animals if they're not kosher.
So you have to check everything that is present.
Yeah, if you kill an insect and eat it, you're still violating the same isurim. If you eat it while it's alive, it's even a little bit nastier. It's a lot bit nastier.
What dates you to open up and look inside before you eat them? Is there anything else that you have to do like that?
According to the Shulchan Aruch, probably every fruit that you eat, you should do that. So, yeah, dried fruits or fresh ones, get in the habit of opening them up and you will be surprised what you find. But the Shulchan Aruch does mention this, and he seems to side with the opinion that whatever can be checked should be.
So an apple, I have to open them up?
So here's his advice. The Shulchan Aruch reads like this: take the apple, slice, cut it in half, cut it open, take a look inside. But it's possible that any given point of the apple was penetrated by a worm that decided to die right there, and I won't find it. So this we don't suspect, but the fact there might be worms or insects inside the core of the apple, it's a quick check.
And if I like eating my apples whole, can I, if there was a worm in there, wouldn't I have had to make a hole?
If you squeeze it really, really hard, it'll look almost like it's... So what he says is basically slice it in half, open it up, then put it back together, and this way you're making a bracha on an entire fruit. That's his advice, because otherwise, what do? You make a bracha, then you slice it open, check, and what happens if there's worms in it? You throw it out. So that's the advice
I'm
that
saying
he
worms have
gives.
to go in from somewhere, and they only come in from the outside, so wouldn't they have left a hole?
Sometimes the food grows around the...
Goes around the worm?
It depends also on the fruit. The loquats, I believe they're called the shesik. in Hebrew. So my father happens to have 2 beautiful trees like this in his front yard. It's a fruit that grows with a hole in it, where the flower closes. It never really closes. And those things are classic for harboring insects. Very tasty, but you have to open them up. So dates, figs, fresh figs and dried ones, But the dried fig, again, you open it up, there's nothing moving, you can't see it, so you assume it's okay. You have no real choice. But fresh leafy greens, herbs, mint, nana, if it's fresh. If it's dried, general assumption is not as big a problem. But whatever you can check, you do. Check them. A whole bunch of kashrut organizations that are trying to rule them out and legislate against them. Check them. What you see, you see. What you don't, you don't. There's no reason to take a strawberry. So you're not going to eat the green stem anyway, right? Okay, so you take it off, cut it, see there's no hole. Maybe cut it in half first.
Yeah, they can also get inside.
Yeah. Okay, so you open it up.
These people that use utensils to eat. My hands.
I mean, you can do it with a knife and a fork. It's a little bit less efficient. My grandmother had the classic knife into your thumb method. Second. Whatever.
So is Rabbi.
Yeah, whatever she was cutting, and amazing, like razor sharp knives. She had the smoothest skin in the world. Cut open strawberries and cut open things. A knife right into her thumb. Open it up. Chick-chack. It's good. It goes. Tough. The good thing is to know. Can pick it up from here next week and see the questions.
It might be a bit of a long, maybe that's not a long question, but let's say something got into your schena and you're eating it on Shabbat and you find it on your spoon. What do you do with?
Whatever you find or whatever you see is clearly a source to consume.
Okay.
Our question is only what obligation do you have to look for it? So if you happen to see it, you happen to see it, you
just
take
took
it
a
out.
spoon out, but then it's not.
So
boiled.
if it's Shabbat and you don't want to pull it out, so you take it out with a little bit of food. That's the Ravad writes like this.
Would you throw the whole out?
Yeah,
No, not necessarily. You throw out whatever you find. A couple of weeks ago, somebody called me and asked me a question like this. I was preparing a pot full of pasta, and I noticed one insect inside the box. It happens. So, do I have the obligation to go back and check it? I said, look, if it's been cooked in such a way that you can no longer tell what's going on in there, probably the baseline of Halakhah is that it's mutar. Good advice? Check it. If you didn't put any sauce or anything else in it, check it. He checked and he found 3 more insects and he ended up throwing that thing out. I mean, you don't know for a fact there are insects there. You have a reason to believe that there might be. There becomes the whole question of what's called a chazakah. If it had a chazakah that most pasta doesn't have insects in it, but I found insects in this box, so this chazakah may no longer apply. So there are certain things you can take and consume on the assumption nothing wrong with them. If you find something wrong with them, bananas is a good example of that. I've never seen insects on bananas, not unless they were peeled and left out for a while. You just don't find insects on bananas. If you happen to find a banana with an insect, then you can't say, well, these things usually don't have insects in them, so this thing is permissible. It doesn't necessarily
So you take out the food with some of the desired product,
Shabbat,
and then the combination.
Because then you're not doing borero, then you're just...
Right.
What are you doing when you eat?
Right.
I mean, yeah, you're taking a spoon. So you take out what otherwise would have been food, and you remove it along with. You could use this. Take a spoon in order to remove wine if there's a fly that flew into your wine or something.
Right.
Something works halakhically speaking. So, Shalom Aleichem. Any questions? Feel free to post tomorrow.
Zimun guy?
Go ahead.
I'm just trying.